Our neighborhood is ruined!
I own the new rules.
The story began with what everyone thought was a harmless piece of abandoned land, a forgotten industrial relic sitting quietly behind a polished suburban HOA neighborhood that prided itself on perfectly, which trimmed lawns and aggressively enforced parking rules. For years, the residents treated that old factory like an eyesore, complaining about its rusted walls, broken windows, and unsightly presence during meetings that dragged on for hours. They believed it was worthless, unusable, and permanently out of the picture. What they didn't realize was that land doesn't care about opinions, and legal ownership doesn't require approval from a neighborhood committee. When I purchased that factory, nobody paid attention. When I began filing permits, they laughed. When I started construction plans, they assumed it would fail. Bro, hearing the way they underestimated the situation was unreal, because while they were busy writing complaints about noise and aesthetics, I was quietly transforming that neglected factory into something they never saw coming. A massive diesel garage built completely within the law, fully compliant, and positioned in a way that would change everything about their quiet little community forever. To when I bought the factory, it wasn't some impulsive revenge move or dramatic gamble. It was a calculated decision, rooted in opportunity, zoning maps, and long-term visions. The building had sat abandoned for years and technically classified as light industrial property, surrounded by a residential HOA community that had expanded outward over time. The neighborhood came later. The factory came first. That detail mattered more than anyone realized. While the HOA board spent their meetings debating paint colors and mailbox uniformity, I was reviewing municipal records, land use codes, environmental reports, and property boundaries. Most people underestimate how powerful documentation can be. Paperwork doesn't argue, it doesn't complain, it doesn't get emotional, it simply defines reality. And reality said that this property was legally eligible for industrial use. The purchase process itself was surprisingly uneventful. No dramatic bidding war, no community resistance, just signatures, verification, and a transfer of ownership. The HOA didn't own the land, and they had no authority over it, and that fact alone created a quiet tension that I knew would surface eventually, but at the time they didn't even notice. They were too busy policing driveway decorations and sending violation letters about trash bins placed 3 inches too far from garage doors. Meanwhile, I was meeting with engineers, surveyors, and zoning consultants to confirm exactly what could be done within full compliance. That's the part people rarely talk about in stories like this. Real strategy isn't out, it's methodical. 3. The factory itself needed extensive renovation. The roof had weak sections. The flooring required reinforcement. Electrical systems were outdated and unsafe. But structurally, it was solid, thick concrete walls, large entry points designed for industrial transport, high ceilings, space that most residential properties could never dream of. When I walked through it for the first time, I didn't see decay, I saw potential. And more importantly, I saw compatibility with heavy vehicle servicing, diesel engines, fleet maintenance, large equipment storage, everything aligned with the building's original design. That alignment became my foundation. Instead of fighting the property's history, I embraced it. I leaned into the industrial classification, applying for the proper permits to convert the building into a compliant diesel repair and maintenance facility. Every submission was documented. Noise mitigation plans, traffic flow studies, environmental compliance checks, fire safety approvals, ventilation system designs. Nothing was hidden. Everything was transparent. And that transparency was intentional. It created an armor of legality that would be extremely difficult for anyone to challenge. The HOA board eventually noticed activity when survey markers appeared around the perimeter. At first, they assumed it was routine maintenance. Then construction vehicles arrived. Still, no one reacted publicly. Behind the scenes, I could feel curiosity building. That's the thing about tightly controlled communities. Change disrupts their sense of dominance. And this factory represented something outside their influence. It didn't fall under their landscaping standards or architectural review committees. It existed independently. That independence quietly unsettled them. For renovation work began in phases. Structural reinforcement came first, then electrical upgrades to support heavy machinery. Industrial-grade ventilation systems were installed to manage exhaust properly. Sound insulation panels were integrated into the walls to minimize noise spillover. Every step was executed according to code. I wasn't cutting corners. In fact, I was exceeding minimum requirements in several areas. And that wasn't in accidental. I wanted this facility to stand as an example of compliance and professionalism. If anyone tried to challenge it later, I wanted inspectors to find nothing but perfection. As construction progressed, small conversations in the neighborhood shifted tone. Residents began noticing trucks delivering materials. Some assumed the building was being turned into storage. Others speculated it might become office space. A few tried to inquire indirectly through informal channels, but because everything was legally filed, there was nothing secret to expose. As when the HOA board requested clarification about potential noise impact. They framed it as concern for community harmony. In reality, it was control. And they wanted to determine whether they could influence the outcome. The response was straightforward. The property was zoned for industrial use, all permits were approved, noise mitigation plans were part of the design, operations would comply with local regulations, and there was no violation. That answer was factual and complete. It also made something very clear. The HOA had no authority over the factory's permitted operations. And that realization began shifting the dynamic. What truly elevated the project was the decision to specialize the facility. Instead of a generic repair shop, it would focus on diesel engines and heavy-duty vehicles. That required stronger lifts, reinforced flooring, high-capacity ventilation, and specialized equipment. 5. The investment was substantial. This wasn't a small garage. It was designed to handle fleet servicing, commercial trucks, and industrial machinery. The scale alone would make it one of the largest facilities of its kind in the region. Bro, the level of planning involved was insane. Every detail mattered. Drainage systems to prevent oil runoff, storage containment for hazardous materials, compliance with environmental disposal regulations. This wasn't a reckless transformation. It was strategic infrastructure development. And because the building already existed, the project didn't require rezoning. It required renovation, and that distinction was everything. During this phase, subtle tension in the neighborhood began rising. Residents started discussing property values. They wondered whether industrial activity would affect resale appeal. Some believed that proximity to a diesel facility would reduce desirability. But again, the factory predated the residential expansion. Legally, the neighborhood had grown around industrial land. That historical context changed the narrative completely. As construction neared completion, I focused on operational readiness. Staff recruitment began. Experienced diesel technicians were hired. Safety training programs were implemented. Certifications were verified. Equipment suppliers delivered heavy-duty lifts and diagnostic systems. The garage floor was sealed with industrial-grade coating designed to resist oil and chemical exposure. Everything was structured for long-term sustainability, and that's when the HOA began sending formal inquiries. Not complaints yet, just inquiries. They requested clarification about operating hours, and they asked about traffic patterns. They expressed community concerns. I responded with documentation. Operational hours would comply with local commercial regulations. Traffic would be managed within the property boundaries. Deliveries would follow designated routes. Again, everything was lawful. 6. What they didn't anticipate was how professional the operation would be. This wasn't a backyard setup. It wasn't a temporary workshop. It was a fully engineered diesel service center built to serve commercial fleets, and because it was legitimate, there was no leverage for shutdown based on aesthetics alone. At this stage, the transformation was nearly complete. The building no longer resembled a neglected factory. It looked modern, reinforced, and purpose-built. Large service doors replaced broken panels. Proper signage identified the facility's function. Security systems were installed for safety and compliance. The property that once symbolized decay now represented structured industrial capability. And the HOA, they were just beginning to understand that this wasn't something they could simply vote away. By the time the diesel garage was nearing full operation, the neighborhood atmosphere had shifted from mild curiosity to quiet agitation. What started as scattered conversations at mailboxes and casual remarks during evening walks slowly evolved into organized discussion inside HOA meetings. The factory, once ignored, had become the central topic, and that alone was a psychological victory, because nothing unsettles a control-driven committee more than something they cannot control. The HOA board began requesting formal documentation beyond what was legally required. They asked for copies of permits they already had access to through public records. They questioned compliance certificates that had been approved by municipal authorities. They attempted to frame routine verification as a community review process. It was subtle at first, almost polite in tone, but beneath the language was the clear intention to find a weakness, a technicality, anything that could be used to delay or restrict operations. 7, bro! The level of overconfidence was wild, and they genuinely believed that if enough pressure was applied, the project would crumble. That's exactly how some boards operate in real life, not by owning authority, but by assuming intimidation equals control. What they didn't account for was preparation. Every permit was valid. Every inspection had been passed. Every compliance box had been checked. There was no hidden shortcut to expose. As the facility's exterior improvements became visible, reactions intensified. The upgraded facade looked clean and professional, which removed the eyesore argument entirely. Landscaping buffers were added along the property edge, not because it was required, but to further reduce any aesthetic complaints. Soundproofing enhancements were finalized before operations began. Even the ventilation system was designed with industrial silencers to minimize noise dispersion. The facility wasn't just compliant, it was optimized. Traffic studies had already predicted the expected flow of vehicles. Since the garage specialized in diesel maintenance, it would primarily service fleet trucks and commercial equipment. Deliveries were scheduled during standard commercial hours. Parking was contained entirely within the property boundary, and there was no overflow into residential streets. That detail mattered more than anything, because once traffic remained internal, and the HOA had no leverage to argue disruption, still, they tried. One of the earliest strategies involved claiming that the facility would change the character of the neighborhood. That phrase appeared repeatedly in meeting summaries. It's a common argument used when legal avenues fail, shifting from rules to emotions, but zoning laws don't recognize emotional discomfort as grounds for shutdown. The factory had been industrial land long before residential expansion. Legally speaking, the neighborhood adapted around it, not the other way around. 8. And that historical fact became the backbone of every response. Documentation showing the factory's original designation eliminated the argument that this was a new intrusion. In reality, it was a revival of intended use. The community had simply grown closer over time. Meanwhile, inside the garage, preparations for launch were underway. Equipment calibration was completed. Safety drills were conducted. Staff were trained in emergency procedures, environmental handling, and customer service standards. The facility wasn't just built for mechanics. It was structured as a professional operation capable of servicing large diesel engines efficiently and responsibly. That level of organization began attracting interest from local commercial clients who valued reliability, and that's when the HOA shifted from passive observation to active resistance. They attempted to introduce new internal guidelines suggesting limitations on surrounding properties. Some proposals included noise restrictions beyond municipal standards and aesthetic modifications aimed at industrial buildings adjacent to residential zones. However, those proposals could not retroactively override existing zoning approvals. Legal counsel clarified that enforcement authority remained with the city, not the HOA. That realization created visible frustration among certain board members. Meetings reportedly became longer and more heated. Some residents supported the garage, recognizing the economic benefit and the professionalism of the project. Others feared perceived decline in neighborhood exclusivity. The community began dividing along lines of perspective rather than rules. That division was significant because when a board loses unanimous support, its power weakens, and weakening authority often leads to overreach attempts. 9. Around this time, subtle complaints began appearing. Minor noise concerns, questions about diesel exhaust, concerns about environmental impact. Each claim was carefully documented and reviewed. Environmental compliance reports showed that filtration systems met regulatory standards, noise levels remained within commercial zoning allowances, air quality measurements complied with city regulations. Every potential objection had already been anticipated during planning. That level of foresight wasn't accidental, it was strategic protection. When you anticipate challenges before they happen, you remove the opportunity for surprise attacks. Bro, this is where things started feeling different. Not dramatic yet, but tense. You could sense that the HOA expected something to go wrong. They were almost waiting for a mistake. But there was no mistake to find. The garage officially opened operations under full compliance. Initial clients arrived, commercial vehicles requiring routine maintenance and diesel diagnostics. The facility handled them efficiently. No disruption spilled into residential zones, and no violations occurred. In fact, the operation ran so smoothly that it began earning a reputation for professionalism. And that's when something unexpected happened. Instead of complaints increasing, curiosity increased. Some residents began asking about employment opportunities. Others inquired about fleet contracts. A few even acknowledged that having a local diesel service center reduced the need for long-distance transport for repairs. Practical benefits started becoming visible. This development complicated the HOA narrative. It was harder to argue against something that operated cleanly and legally while also providing services. The emotional argument weakened in the face of tangible functionality. Still, resistance didn't disappear. 10. The board began discussing potential community impact assessments. They sought ways to review the facility under broader interpretations of neighborhood standards. However, legal consultation reaffirmed that industrial zoning rights superseded HOA aesthetic policies. The garage operated within municipal jurisdiction, not community preference. That distinction became the turning point in this phase of the story, because now the factory wasn't just a building anymore. It was a fully operational diesel garage with certified compliance, environmental safeguards, traffic containment, and professional staff standing firm behind a neighborhood that couldn't legally stop it. The tension was building quietly, and while the HOA tried to strategize the next move, the foundation of the garage was already too strong to challenge without evidence of wrongdoing. There was none. The transformation was complete. The operation was stable. The paperwork was airtight. But the conflict wasn't novel. It was just entering its next stage. The moment the diesel garage proved it could operate smoothly without violating a single regulation, the HOA's frustration shifted into strategy mode. They could no longer argue about permits, zoning, or compliance. So the focus changed. Instead of challenging legality, they began searching for pressure points. That's when the tone of their internal meetings reportedly grew sharper. The discussion was no longer about aesthetics. It was about influence. And influence, when it fails, often turns into escalation. The first wave of escalation came in the form of intensified inspections. Complaints were submitted to city departments and framed as concerns about environmental safety and neighborhood impact. Each complaint triggered a formal review process. Inspectors visited the property, examined documentation, walked the facility, and reviewed operational systems. 11. Every time the findings confirmed compliance, ventilation met standards, waste handling procedures followed regulations, and noise levels remained within permitted commercial thresholds. There were no violations to cite. Bro, watching that play out would have been unbelievable in real time. The board clearly expected something to stick, but nothing did. And that's when frustration started replacing strategy. When regulatory complaints failed, the next tactic focused on public perception. Subtle communication circulated among residents suggesting that industrial activity could eventually lower property values. The language was cautious but designed to spark uncertainty. Property value anxiety is powerful in HOA communities. Even the suggestion of risk can influence opinions. However, real estate markets respond to broader economic factors. Infrastructure, demand, and location, not simply the presence of legally zoned commercial property that existed before neighborhood expansion. Meanwhile, inside the garage, operations continued to scale gradually. More fleet contracts were secured. The facility's reputation for professionalism spread among local businesses. Diesel vehicle owners appreciated having a specialized service center nearby. The building that once symbolized decay was now generating activity, employment, and commercial traffic that stayed fully contained within property lines. A containment was crucial because traffic management was one of the HOA's earliest concerns. But since all vehicles entered and exited through designated industrial access points without encroaching on residential roads, and there was no enforceable complaint, every design element had anticipated this. And when that approach failed, the board attempted a procedural angle. They reviewed community guidelines and tried to reinterpret aesthetic clauses in ways that could indirectly affect exterior modifications. 12, however, the factory's transformation had already complied with city-level approval. Once municipal permits were granted and inspections completed, HOA preferences could not override them. And the garage did not fall under architectural review for residential homes, and that legal boundary became increasingly obvious to everyone involved. And that's when the escalation took a more aggressive tone. Suddenly, notices began appearing alleging minor concerns. From signage visibility to perceived lighting brightness during evening hours, each claim was reviewed and measured. Exterior lighting had been installed according to commercial standards, with downward-facing fixtures to prevent light spill. Signage complied with industrial zoning requirements. Nothing exceeded regulatory limits. Every time an issue was raised, documentation resolved it. At this point, the dynamic had changed from neighborhood disagreement to structured confrontation. The HOA was no longer simply reacting. It was attempting to construct a narrative that might justify stronger measures. Meetings reportedly included discussions about exploring legal interpretations and potential restrictions related to environmental compatibility. But here's the reality. Zoning rights are not easily overturned without substantial evidence of violation. And the garage had deliberately been designed to avoid violations entirely. Bro, that level of preparation is what separates impulsive moves from calculated strategy. This wasn't a reactionary build, it was engineered defense from day one. As pressure increased, so did internal support for the garage among certain residents. Some community members appreciated the professionalism of the facility, others valued the convenience of having diesel. Repair services nearby without traveling long distances. A small but growing group began questioning why the HOA was spending so much time focusing on a compliant industrial property instead of routine neighborhood maintenance. 13 at internal division weakened the board's unified stance. Escalation attempts then shifted toward administrative delays. The HOA explored procedural challenges, hoping to complicate documentation renewals or raise questions about ongoing compliance requirements. However, municipal oversight mechanisms ensured that inspections were periodic and standardized, the garage remained prepared for each one, and records were organized and accessible. Safety protocols were consistently maintained. The facility wasn't just operating, it was operating defensively, anticipating scrutiny. And that anticipation mattered because when a project stands on solid legal ground, escalation without evidence becomes increasingly difficult to sustain. Still, tension in the neighborhood continued rising. Conversations grew louder, opinions became sharper. Some residents expressed concern over change itself rather than specific impact. Change can feel threatening in communities that value stability and uniformity, but stability does not mean stagnation, and legality does not require community approval when zoning rights are already established. The garage's presence had become undeniable. It wasn't temporary, it wasn't experimental, it was permanent infrastructure, and that realization set the stage for what would come next. Because when procedural tactics fail, the final escalation often involves attempting to apply pressure through broader channels. And that's exactly where the conflict was heading. As the earlier strategies continued failing, the HOA shifted from polite inquiries to formal pressure. This was the phase where frustration stopped hiding behind friendly language. Official letters became more frequent. The tone grew more rigid. References to community standards and neighborhood harmony started appearing in bold formatting within notices. it was clear they were escalating internally, searching for leverage that did not rely on zoning laws. 14. One of the first major attempts involved proposing new internal amendments to expand review authority over adjacent properties. On paper, it sounded procedural. In practice, it was an effort to reinterpret their scope in a way that could indirectly challenge the garage's exterior operations. However, the key issue remained unchanged. The factory's industrial zoning existed independently of HOA governance. Community bylaws cannot override municipal land use classifications. That boundary is firm. When legal boundaries blocked them again, the focus shifted toward operational discomfort claims. The board began documenting alleged disturbances, not violations, but perceived inconveniences. They referenced delivery activity, mechanical equipment movement, and general industrial presence as potential stressors. Each claim was carefully evaluated against city standards, noise levels were measured, traffic flow was reviewed, air quality compliance was confirmed, everything remained within permitted limits. The garage had been designed specifically to prevent escalation triggers. Soundproofing panels absorbed internal noise. Ventilation systems filtered exhaust before release. Loading schedules were structured to avoid residential peak hours. These were not reactive adjustments, they were pre-planned safeguards. And that preparation started becoming obvious to everyone watching. Bro, at this stage it wasn't even about the garage anymore. It was about control. The HOA had invested emotional energy into trying to stop something that was legally unstoppable, and the more they failed, the more determined they seemed to become. Internally, the board began discussing whether to pursue external legal consultation to explore any possible angle. However, once independent legal review confirmed compliance, their path narrowed further. Without evidence of violations, enforcement agencies had no basis for intervention. Regulatory bodies operate on standards, not preferences. And 15, meanwhile, the garage continued building its reputation. Commercial clients valued the reliability and specialization of the diesel facility, and fleet operators appreciated having a nearby service center capable of handling heavy-duty engines. The property was no longer viewed as abandoned land, it was now part of the local economic ecosystem. That shift in perception quietly undermined the HOA's narrative. Some residents began noticing the contrast between expectations and reality. They'd been told the facility might disrupt the neighborhood, yet daily life remained stable. No streets were blocked, no residential access was restricted, no environmental incidents occurred. The garage operated within its industrial boundaries without spilling over. And that containment was critical because every escalation attempt depended on the idea of impact. Without impact, there was no justification. As frustration mounted, minor confrontations reportedly occurred during meetings. Board members debated whether the community had been sufficiently informed. Some suggested distributing educational material about potential industrial effects. Even though the facility met all standards, the strategy seemed aimed at shaping opinion rather than addressing facts. Opinion campaigns can influence perception, but they cannot override compliance. The garage management remained focused on operations, staff training continued, equipment maintenance schedules were maintained, safety audits were conducted proactively, documentation was updated regularly, transparency became a shield, and that transparency removed ambiguity. When inspections occurred, the facility passed without issue. Each successful review reinforced its legitimacy. Instead of finding grounds for restriction, inspectors confirmed adherence to requirements. And that pattern began repeating, and repetition builds credibility. At this stage, escalation started losing momentum. 16. The HOA had attempted procedural pressure, environmental scrutiny, aesthetic reinterpretation, and narrative influence. None produced actionable violations. And without violations, enforcement pathways remained closed. And that realization began shifting the energy inside the board. Some members reportedly started questioning whether continued confrontation was productive. Others still believed persistence would yield results. The divide widened, and when leadership divides, strategy weakens. Meanwhile, the garage prepared for long-term stability. Operational systems were optimized, Energy efficiency measures were evaluated, maintenance protocols were refined. The facility was not only functioning, it was strengthening. And that's when something subtle but important happened. Instead of reacting to each complaint individually, the garage's management began compiling a comprehensive compliance portfolio, a centralized record of permits, inspection results, environmental reports, and operational certifications. It wasn't created for drama, it was created for readiness. Because escalation often comes in waves, and having everything documented in one place ensures immediate response capability. The HOA's attempts to increase pressure had unintentionally pushed the garage into even stronger procedural organization. Every challenge became an opportunity to reinforce legitimacy. And that's the irony of over-escalation. When you push against something solid, you don't move it, you reinforce it. By the end of this escalation phase, the conflict had reached a stalemate. The garage remained fully operational. The HOA had exhausted most of its internal avenues. Public complaints had failed to generate violations, and legal interpretations consistently favored zoning rights. The neighborhood was stable. The diesel facility was stable, but the tension had not disappeared. It had simply reached its peak. 17, and that set the stage for what would come next. Not incremental pressure, but a decisive turning point. By the time the conflict reached its peak, something had fundamentally changed inside the neighborhood. The garage was no longer a speculative project under review. It was a fully operational diesel service center with documented compliance, established clientele, and visible infrastructure improvements. What had started as an irritation for the HOA had evolved into a permanent fixture backed by municipal approval. And permanence has a way of reshaping arguments. The board attempted one final round of coordinated action, this time focusing on gathering resident complaints in bulk. Instead of isolated concerns, they sought collective submissions that might appear more substantial to regulatory bodies. However, complaint volume does not override compliance status. Authorities evaluate evidence, not popularity. When inspectors reviewed the compiled concerns, the findings remained consistent. The facility operated within approved limits. That consistency was becoming the garage's strongest weapon. Bro, this is where the dynamic flipped. For months, the HOA had been trying to define the narrative. Now the narrative was being defined by documented results. Every inspection report reinforced legitimacy. Every compliance update strengthened credibility. The factory wasn't just surviving pressure, it was thriving under scrutiny. Meanwhile, business growth accelerated. Commercial contracts increased steadily. Fleet operators valued reliability, turnaround speed, and specialization. The diesel focus allowed the facility to carve out a clear niche rather than competing with generic repair shops. That specialization created efficiency, and efficiency attracted more clients. Revenue stability allowed further investment into equipment upgrades and staff development. 18. The garage expanded its service capabilities within the same footprint. Additional heavy-duty lifts were installed, and diagnostic technology was upgraded. Storage systems were reorganized to optimize workflow. The facility became more streamlined with each improvement. And because everything remained within zoning guidelines, there was no legal basis for interference. At this stage, the HOA's influence was mostly limited to internal governance of residential properties. Their attempts to extend authority over the industrial site had repeatedly failed. The legal boundary had become undeniable, and when an organization repeatedly encounters that boundary without success, it faces a choice: adapt or escalate beyond its capacity. Some residents began recognizing the practical benefits of the garage. Nearby commercial drivers found convenient access to diesel maintenance. Local businesses appreciated reduced travel time for fleet repairs. The presence of a professional facility contributed indirectly to the area's economic activity. While opinions about aesthetics varied, functionality became harder to dismiss. The board's meetings reportedly shifted tone again. Instead of focusing solely on restrictions, discussions began addressing how to coexist with the facility. That shift signaled something important. It meant recognition was replacing resistance. And recognition often marks the beginning of resolution, but not everyone was ready to accept that reality. A final attempt involved exploring whether broader municipal reviews could reinterpret operational classifications. However, zoning categories are defined by official land use plans, not community sentiment. The factory's historical industrial designation, combined with approved conversion permits, made it legally secure without evidence of violation. Regulatory agencies had no grounds for action. That was the turning point, because once legal pathways close, confrontation loses leverage. 19 inside the garage, operations had reached full efficiency. The workflow was smooth, client scheduling was organized, safety protocols were routine, the facility functioned like any well-run industrial business should. There were no disruptions spilling into residential streets, no environmental incidents, no code violations, just structured activity within a designated industrial property. The contrast between perception and reality became increasingly clear. For months, the HOA had framed the garage as a potential threat, yet daily life remained unchanged for most residents. Lawns were still maintained, homes retained their structure, the neighborhood continued operating normally. And the difference was that now there was a thriving industrial facility nearby, one that existed long before the homes expanded around it. That historical context reshaped the narrative completely, and as the garage success became more visible, community opinion gradually diversified. Some residents acknowledged that the factory's transformation had been handled responsibly. Others appreciated the professionalism and lack of disruption. Even those who preferred quieter surroundings could not deny the legality of the operation. The climax wasn't explosive, it was structural. The HOA had attempted pressure, complaints, reinterpretations, and collective influence. None succeeded. The garage had responded not with confrontation, but with preparation, compliance, and growth. And that approach created something far stronger than resistance. It created legitimacy. By this stage, the conflict had moved from active escalation into a waiting phase. The board could no longer challenge the facility without risking credibility. The garage, on the other hand, continued strengthening operations and refining systems. And that shift set up the final phase of the story, where consequences naturally unfold from actions already taken, because sometimes the climax isn't about revenge. 20. It's about standing firm until reality settles. The real turning point arrived quietly, without fireworks or dramatic announcements. It came in the form of documentation, finalized inspection reports, renewed permits, and formal acknowledgments of compliance that confirmed the diesel garage met every regulatory requirement. Those documents didn't just defend the operation, they cemented it. Once approvals were officially recorded and archived, the facility moved from new project under scrutiny to established industrial business in good standing. That status changed everything. The HOA board realized that continued resistance was no longer productive. Every complaint they submitted had already been evaluated. Every inspection confirmed compliance. Every legal interpretation reinforced zoning rights. At some point, repeating the same argument stops being strategy and starts becoming noise. And noise without evidence loses credibility. Bro, that shift must have been frustrating for them. When you build an entire campaign around stopping something and it just keeps passing every review, it forces a reckoning. Reality doesn't bend because of preference. It responds to law and documentation. Inside the community, conversations began changing tone as well. Instead of speculation about potential disruption, residents were observing actual outcomes. The garage operated during approved hours. Deliveries stayed within the property boundaries. Noise mitigation systems functioned effectively. There were no environmental violations, no traffic overflow, no code breaches, and the predicted chaos never materialized. That gap between expectation and reality became impossible to ignore. 21. The facility's professional reputation continued growing beyond the neighborhood. Fleet operators and commercial clients valued consistent service quality because the garage specialized in diesel engines. It developed efficiency systems tailored specifically for heavy-duty maintenance. That focus reduced turnaround time and increased reliability. Word of mouth among business owners started expanding its client base. This growth reinforced financial stability, which in turn supported further reinvestment. Additional safety improvements were implemented, equipment upgrades enhanced precision diagnostics, staff certifications were maintained and expanded. The garage didn't just survive scrutiny, it evolved because of it. Meanwhile, the HOA faced internal pressure from residents who questioned the ongoing focus on the factory. Some members felt the board's energy might be better directed toward typical neighborhood concerns rather than an industrial property that already passed all required approvals. When leadership decisions begin drawing internal criticism, authority weakens naturally, not because of conflict, but because of division. That internal shift was subtle but powerful. Without unanimous backing, aggressive strategies become harder to justify. The board had to weigh legal costs, community perception, and the likelihood of success. And every evaluation pointed to the same conclusion. The garage was operating within full compliance, and there was no regulatory foundation to remove or restrict it. At this stage, the climax wasn't about confrontation anymore, it was about inevitability. The factory's transformation had been completed correctly, documented thoroughly, and inspected repeatedly. That layered defense created stability, and stability is difficult to challenge without new evidence. 22. The diesel garage presence also introduced a different kind of outcome: economic normalization. Over time, industrial facilities operating responsibly can coexist with residential areas when boundaries are respected. The garage demonstrated that coexistence was possible. It did not intrude, it did not expand beyond zoning limits, it remained contained, professional, and compliant. That containment mattered more than anything else. Because once a facility proves it can function responsibly without impacting surrounding residences, objections based solely on preference lose strength. As months passed, the tension gradually decreased, not because opinions changed overnight, but because results spoke louder than assumptions. The board eventually shifted from attempting escalation to focusing on standard neighborhood governance. The factory was no longer the central agenda item in meetings, and that change signaled something important. The climax of the story wasn't destruction or humiliation, it was structural resolution. The garage stood firm under scrutiny. The HOA's attempts to override zoning failed consistently. Legal authority remained where it belonged, with municipal regulation, not community preference. The transformation of the factory became a case study in how preparation, compliance, and strategic planning can protect a project from unnecessary interference. Bro, this is the part that hits differently, and instead of reacting emotionally, the approach was patient, documented, and methodical. That kind of strategy doesn't create chaos, it creates permanence. The diesel garage was now established, clients were steady, operations were efficient, compliance was confirmed. The building that once represented neglect had become a symbol of structured industrial success. And with that stability in place, the conflict reached its natural peak, not through confrontation, but through undeniable completion. 23. The HOA could not reverse what had already been lawfully executed. The property had been purchased legally, permits had been approved, inspections had been passed. The transformation was permanent under existing regulations. That realization marked the end of escalation. From here, the story moves into resolution, where both sides adjust to the new reality. After the tension reached its peak, something subtle but powerful began to happen in the neighborhood. Routine returned, not because anyone admitted defeat, and not because opinions magically aligned, but because reality has a way of stabilizing situations that legal systems have already settled. The diesel garage remained fully operational, compliant, and structured within its industrial zoning. The HOA, having exhausted its escalation attempts, gradually shifted back to its core responsibilities, maintaining residential standards rather than attempting to influence a property outside its authority. That transition didn't happen overnight. It unfolded slowly, almost quietly. Meeting agendas that once revolved around the factory began returning to landscaping reviews, infrastructure repairs, and community improvements. The garage was still mentioned occasionally, but no longer as a central threat. Instead, it was treated as a permanent neighboring business that required simple coexistence. Bro, this is where the story takes a different kind of turn. There's no dramatic collapse, no last-minute twist, just the steady reality that preparation beats pressure when something is built correctly from the start. It becomes extremely difficult to dismantle without cause. 24 inside the garage, operations continued strengthening. With the conflict settling down, the management team focused even more on refining processes. Workflow efficiency improved. Staff coordination became smoother. Maintenance schedules were optimized. Because the facility specialized in diesel engines, it had carved out a clear identity in the local market. That specialization reduced competition with General Auto. Shopson positioned it as a technical resource for fleet operators. The business side of the operation became a quiet victory. Steady clients meant predictable revenue. Predictable revenue meant reinvestment. Reinvestment meant upgrades in safety, equipment, and infrastructure. Each improvement reinforced the facility's long-term viability. Instead of reacting to criticism, the garage evolved through structured growth. Meanwhile, within the neighborhood, perceptions began adjusting. Over time, residents realized that the predicted disruptions had not materialized. Noise levels remained within permitted limits. Traffic stayed contained inside the property. Environmental safeguards functioned as designed. The industrial presence did not spill into daily residential life. That consistency slowly reduced emotional resistance. And consistency builds trust even in environments where trust was initially low. Some residents even began acknowledging practical advantages. Having a nearby diesel service center meant commercial vehicles did not need to travel far for maintenance. That could translate into faster repair cycles for local businesses. Operating trucks or equipment, while the garage was not designed specifically for residential benefit, its presence contributed indirectly to local commerce. 25. The HOA board also experienced a shift in dynamics. Internal discussions reportedly became more collaborative and less reactive. When a group spends months attempting to challenge something without success, reflection becomes necessary. Leadership sometimes realizes that focusing energy on uncontrollable factors reduces effectiveness in areas that truly require attention. That realization appeared to guide the community toward coexistence. Legally, the garage status remained unchanged, fully compliant, properly zoned, and documented. That stability removed ambiguity. There was no hidden loophole to exploit, no pending violation waiting to surface. Everything had been done transparently, and transparency eliminates leverage. Bro, that's the real takeaway here. When you move with documentation, compliance, and planning, you remove the drama before it even starts. It might not be flashy, but it's powerful. As time passed, interactions between the garage staff and the surrounding community became routine. Deliveries followed established routes. Operations adhered to scheduled hours. Security and lighting remained consistent with approved standards. The building integrated into the landscape as an established industrial neighbor rather than an intruding presence. The narrative gradually shifted from conflict to normalization. Importantly, the garage did not attempt to provoke the HOA or highlight the earlier disputes. Instead, it focused on professionalism. No public confrontation. No unnecessary escalation. Just steady operation. That restraint contributed to long-term stability, because sometimes the strongest response to resistance is simply sustained excellence. 26. The neighborhood began settling into its new equilibrium. Residents who initially feared disruption saw that their daily routines continued uninterrupted. Property maintenance standards remained intact. Community activities proceeded normally. Over time, the garage became background context rather than headline news. And that's how resolution often happens in real life, not with applause, but with adaptation. From a broader perspective, the situation demonstrated how zoning laws function. Industrial properties can coexist near residential areas when regulations are followed carefully. It requires planning, respect for boundaries, and adherence to environmental and safety standards. When those elements are in place, conflict tends to dissolve naturally. The diesel garage now stood as an example of that principle. Its transformation from abandoned factory to modern service facility represented not only physical renovation, but strategic execution. Every phase, purchase, permitting, compliance, construction, and operation had been handled methodically. That structure ensured that no single complaint could destabilize the project. And as the months continued, the story gradually transitioned away from confrontation altogether. The factory was no longer a controversy. It was a business, it was infrastructure, it was permanent, and that permanence marked the resolution phase of the journey. As the months rolled forward, the neighborhood entered a quieter rhythm. The diesel garage operated steadily, and the earlier tension slowly faded into memory. What once triggered emergency meetings and heated discussions became just another established part of the area's landscape. That transition didn't happen because anyone won in a dramatic sense. It happened because the system worked the way it was designed to work. Zoning laws were respected. Permits were approved, inspections were passed. When those pieces aligned, there is very little room for continued conflict. 27. The HOA, having exhausted every reasonable avenue, naturally returned its focus to residential governance. Landscaping standards, maintenance guidelines, and community planning regained priority. Over time, the factory was no longer framed as a threat, but as a neighboring industrial asset operating within its legal boundaries. That reframing was subtle but important. It meant acceptance through evidence rather than emotion. Inside the garage, stability allowed long-term improvements. Equipment updates continued. Safety procedures remained consistent. Staff training stayed ongoing. The facility operated with professionalism and structure, and reinforcing its reputation among commercial clients. Because it specialized in diesel systems, it maintained a clear niche which helped sustain consistent demand without unnecessary expansion beyond its approved footprint. What stands out most in this phase is how normal everything became. No escalating disputes, no regulatory findings, no violations, just routine coexistence between residential homes and a legally established and industrial property. The contrast between the earlier conflict and the present stability highlights an important reality. When projects are built correctly from the beginning, they don't need to rely on confrontation to survive. Bro, that's the part people don't always talk about. The real revenge isn't chaos, it's endurance. It's creating something so solid that opposition simply runs out of ground to stand on. And that's exactly what happened here. The garage didn't expand into the neighborhood, it didn't disrupt daily life, it functioned within its approved limits. And because of that, the community gradually adapted. Over time, adaptation replaced resistance, and coexistence replaced conflict. That's where this chapter settles. Not in victory, not in defeat, but in equilibrium. 28. Looking back at this entire situation, the biggest lesson isn't about outsmarting anyone or turning a property into a dramatic statement. It's about preparation, legality, and patience. When someone purchases land, follows zoning laws, secures permits, passes inspections, and builds within compliance, the outcome is determined long before any neighborhood disagreement begins. Documentation becomes protection, transparency becomes leverage, and structure becomes strength. A lot of HOA conflicts in real life escalate because emotions move faster than facts. Communities sometimes react to change before understanding the legal framework behind it. But zoning regulations exist for a reason, and they define what can and cannot be done on a property. When those regulations are followed correctly, there's very little room for permanent obstruction. The transformation of the factory into a diesel garage also shows how abandoned or underused industrial spaces can be repurposed responsibly. With proper planning, industrial sites can operate safely alongside residential areas without crossing boundaries. That balance depends on compliance, engineering standards, and long-term maintenance, not confrontation. In the end, the story isn't about revenge. It's about executing a vision carefully and letting systems work. When everything is done by the book, the results speak for themselves. And sometimes, the quietest victories are the ones built to last. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next one. On this channel, we turn real-style HOA drama, pro-revenge, and malicious compliance situations into cinematic narration. Stories that feel intense, structured, and satisfying from start to finish. Every script is original, fully dramatized, and designed for binge-worthy storytelling without unnecessary filler. 29. Drop a comment and let me know what you think. Was this a smart long-term strategy, or would you have handled the HOA differently? I read your ideas, and they often inspire future story twists. If you've experienced your own HOA battle, property dispute, or neighborhood conflict, share below. Your story could become the next feature. If you want more content like this, hit the like button to help the video reach more viewers who enjoy structured revenge narratives and legal comeback stories. And don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss a new upload. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.